Welcome everybody to the webinar, Exploring Progressive Delivery. We're going to start in about a minute or so. We still got many people joining. Really appreciate your time. This is going to be a great webinar today. We'll start in about a minute. Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Exploring Progressive Delivery. My name is Mark Levy and I'll be hosting today's webinar. I focus on product marketing here at OpsMx. First, a few housekeeping items. Today's session's about 50 minutes long. We're going to record the session. We're recording the session. We'll send you the recording of the slides to anyone who requests them. Ask questions in the chat. We'll definitely answer as many questions as we can. A little bit about OpsMx. Bob, if you can advance the slide, that'd be great. We are dedicated to making the process of a continuous delivery easy and successful for you. We have a large number of customers of every size, from the most sophisticated, including companies like Cisco and Salesforce, to organizations who are now highly successful, even though they had little or no continuous delivery experience when we started with them. So what I'd like to first do is just to get to know a little bit about you is we're going to have a little poll here while we introduce our speaker. If you can just spend a second answering the poll. And what I'd like to do while you're answering the poll is introduce our speaker today, Bob Boulay. Bob, you've probably seen Bob or heard Bob before, either on this webinar, if you were at CDCon. Bob, and you stopped by our booth, you probably talked to Bob. Bob is a passionate about technology, an expert at Spinnaker and CI/CD. He's got over 19 years of solution engineering experience, and he's our head of solution engineering. So, hey, Bob, how are you doing?
I'm hanging in there, my friend. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I am a guy who loves technology, and honestly, guys, I get excited every time Mark comes to me and says, "Hey, we want to put on one of these events." It's a lot of fun for me, and I'm looking forward to this one. So thank you, Mark.
Yeah, well, why don't you start us off?
All right, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So, guys, today we want to talk about sort of progressive delivery. I think in any business that you happen to be in, or any discipline that you happen to be in, we're not going to introduce concepts that I think are wildly unfamiliar to most folks that spent some time in DevOps, but I think they're important concepts. I think they're, and I think the market has sort of packaged these things together and called them progressive delivery. But I think ultimately it's sort of some of the same sort of safe deployment strategies that we're all familiar with. But I thought, as a subject of this webinar, we'd go through them. We'd help understand sort of what they are and sort of how to implement them, some of the things to consider as you're looking at implementing them. And then I think, looking at, again, in a selfish manner, sort of how we might be able to help you implement them, in a way that makes sense and is easier for you to ultimately make decisions. Because at the end of the day, progressive delivery is really about making decisions, right? It's about, hey, let me expose this new code to some part of some audience somewhere. Let me sort of see how it performs. Let me get some feedback, and then let me make a data-driven decision around how I want to continue. Do I want to roll forward, or do I want to roll back, right? And so I think it takes many different forms, which we're going to talk about here today. But let's go ahead and jump right in. I'm one of these guys that likes to start off with sort of definitions, right? So what do we what are we doing here when we talk about progressive delivery? What does that translate to? And I think it really boils down to the art of moving fast, but with control, right? I think we, as DevOps professionals, we're all feeling that pressure from our business to sort of turn releases out faster, to turn features out faster, to ultimately make sure if there is badness, that badness window is minimized. Our businesses don't want, that scenario where code sits on the shelf. Code sits for a period of time because the business feels like it's losing its competitive advantage when that happens. And so it's up to us to figure out sort of how to make this work. And so the ability in a controlled fashion to deploy new releases in phases, it provides safeguards and control levers that'll help us mitigate the risk of continuously pushing new code to a production environment. And again, I think progressive delivery enables us to pursue CI/CD safely. That's why you'll hear these called sort of safe deployments, right? And I want to make sure that we're taking those baby steps. And so that's sort of from a definitional perspective, sort of what we're trying to accomplish, and that sort of sets the stage for the rest of this. Now, you guys know I've used this slide before. One of the tenets of progressive delivery is around being able to deploy fast, right? And one of the reasons why progressive delivery exists is that when you start to deploy faster, that's where you start to see increased failure rates. As the volume and the velocity at which you deploy starts to ratchet up, you start to see failures ratchet up, or the number of failures ratchet up. That's really where progressive deployment is going to come in allowing us to go ahead and actually mitigate some of the risks associated with moving faster. Sort of, how do I get code to market faster? How do I flush out whether or not there's a problem? I can do a lot of things in QA. I can do a lot of things in terms of functional testing, but until I actually apply some actual pressure to this thing, how do I know? And so that's really sort of what we're after here, is sort of helping you deal with the message that this slide's essentially saying, which is the faster you attempt to move, the more prone you're going to be to problems. So how do we do this? What are the options here, right? I mean, some of you might be saying, yeah, I've heard this bandied about, some folks have been talking about it. I've been to a couple of meetups where it's been discussed, but let's get into the details. What are the options that you have? And so, I think what I like to do is, and what I'm doing with this slide here, is sort of rolling out sort of the ones that I want to cover today, right? In the art of doing this, in terms of the ways you could go about doing it. So there are various methods that are at our disposal. And we're going to go into detail here as we take a look closer at these 4 particular elements. Something like a targeted rollout, where, again, as the name implies, I'm going to go ahead and actually pick certain groups that I want to go ahead and deploy this to. A canary rollout. Here, I'm going to actually pick a percentage of my production traffic that I'm going to steer toward this. It doesn't matter who it is. It's I want a cross section of whoever shows up. I want 10% to hit this new code and sort of see what happens. Ring deployments. Again, I think when we think about ring deployments, we're thinking about, again, picking instead of picking targeted groups of customers, we're picking classifications of customers or users, classifications of people, or the types of deployments. And so the folks that sort of are in my canary group, that might be one group, and then I extend the blast radius to those that are early adopters, and then I extend the blast radius further to some other classification. And then doing things like percentage rollouts being sort of rolling upgrades, right? Or rolling thunder, where I say, hey, let me expose 25% of the traffic. Let me then expose 45% of the traffic, 50, 80, 100, and then sort of rolling it out like that. All 4 methods involve sort of the same DevOps related disciplines, right? You have to have a deploy strategy. In a lot of cases, you have to be able to shift traffic or expose users. You have to be able to analyze performance behavior. And I think this is the part that is key here, right? These last two bullets is I need to be able to analyze the performance and the behavior. In some cases, as a DevOps professional, I'm interested in how this thing is performing as I apply pressure to it, right? Is there any metrics that are out of whack? Are there any sort of anomalous log messages that I'm seeing? But a product owner might come along and say, I'm also interested in sort of how they're using this new feature. So there's a lot of different personas here that I think are important to sort of understand. Then I think, you have to make that decision, right? You have to, regardless of how you're doing this, you have to make a decision as to whether or not you're going to proceed or roll out or retreat and roll back, right? And so, or, and again, I think from a DevOps perspective, that becomes a very tactical decision. You've also have, from a product owner and an SRE perspective, different perspectives that may want to look at this and say, yeah, I don't think this is going quite as we thought, or I've got some negative feedback. It depends on the situation and sort of how you're rolling it out that ultimately is going to drive sort of those things. But you need to be able to make, from a DevOps perspective anyway, we need to be able to make data-driven decisions around sort of what we're going to do here. So let's take a closer look at sort of how you might want to implement some of these various deployment strategies. So targeted rollouts, it involves targeting of groups of users for the new deployment. If you look down at the bottom there, so customers with attribute X, customers with attribute Y, customers with attribute Z. I think, this requires some forward-looking design and engineering, right? So we need to be able to isolate or sort of isolate sort of customers with these attributes and then steer them toward this, and so there is a little bit of sort of forward looking that needs to happen here, and then obviously when it comes to feedback phases, we have sort of a functional phase. Sort of what did the user think of the feature set? Because typically we're doing something like this in conjunction with a product owner who wants to better understand sort of maybe a new feature, a new function, and wants to make sure that how is customer X experiencing it versus customer Z. But we also have the operational part of this. How did this perform under pressure? What happened? Did we see anything that looked concerning? And then obviously we need to be prepared to run the operational analysis after each phase of the rollout. So as the testing was going on with customer X, that group, what happened? What was going on with the application? And you want to make sure you understand your decision criteria before you get started. There's nothing worse than being in a knock or being in a war room and trying to decide whether or not to move something forward if you haven't really figured out sort of what the criteria is going to look like. And so your product owner might say, hey, they loved it, but you're saying, well, wait a minute, there's some problems here, and we need to bring some other folks in to sort of make those decisions. But those targeted rollouts, again, you're targeting specific customer types, customer attributes, or personas to ultimately roll something out. And again, I think, when we think about the risk mitigation there, it's a very controlled situation, and you get to sort of proceed as you need to. And we'll talk about sort of the decision-making process a little bit later in the presentation. Then there's the Canary deployments. And so, this strategy involves targeting percentages of the application traffic to expose to the new deployment. Again, you're trying to control that blast radius. You don't, if something goes wrong, your worst case scenario is only 5% or only 10% of your customers had to experience it, which again isn't great, but is better than 100%. And in this case here, we need to use something to be able to shape the traffic. So I want to be able to go ahead and deploy this, and then I want to ultimately steer a portion of traffic toward this new piece. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. In the demo portion of the presentation today, I'll bring you through sort of what some of that looks like. You need to be able to roll back should we find an issue, right? So if you start to see issues, or you see an issue during the Canary, obviously you need to have a path to roll back, and that path should be built into the pipeline, right? The pipeline should trigger an analysis, and allow you to go ahead and analyze data, and then ultimately decide based on that decision whether or not you want to roll forward or roll back. We need to be able to roll it forward should we decide. So if everything looks good, let's go ahead and push forward, and let's go ahead and change that traffic to the Canary from, say, 10% to 100%, and let's start the process of tearing down the old. And again, I think we need to be able to make data-driven decisions when it comes to roll forward or roll back. We need to be able to analyze the information, understand how the application is performing, and really look at it, sort of below the surface, and understand, and also work with our partners, work with, the product owners, work with our SREs, those folks that are responsible for making sure that the application is stable and stays up and is continuing to, once it's sort of deployed, continue to sort of deliver that value that the customer was looking for. And so again, the Canary is about, sort of exposing a portion of that traffic, and it not really caring who it is, right? I'm not really worried about who it is. I just want to say, I want 5% or 10% to go to this new deployment. I want to let that run for a period of time, and then I want to analyze, and then I want to make a decision. Ring deployments, as we talked about, are really about sort of targeting categories of users, and again, controlling blast radius, right? So, I might want to have a group of people, I call my canaries. They're the ones that are always willing to sort of try new things, or ultimately have signed up for a sort of, first look program or something along those lines. That's my core. And then I want to, as I do the deployment to those folks, I then want to go ahead and extend it to my early adopters. Now, in between, I'm making an analysis. And again, I think some of the challenges here are that it requires something a little bit more forward-looking, because I need to make sure I have an isolation strategy for the rollout. I need to have a feedback loop prepared, again, functional and operational. I need to have a decision criteria planned, and that needs to be agreed across all of the entire sort of ecosystem. That's our product owners, our DevOps, our SREs, and I need to have a rollout or rollback plan. So let's say I get through and I deploy this to Canaries and they start to use it. Product owner's doing his interviews. I'm looking at this operationally. I can then roll to the next group, my early adopters. And again, I can do the same thing. I can look at sort of, now that I've got a wider audience. Again, I'm much like the sort of rolling thunder. This is cumulative, and I'm sort of putting more and more pressure on this. So let me roll this out to my early adopters, and again, get their feedback, but also operationally look at, sort of how is this reacting? Are there any red flags? And then ultimately out to my user base, right? And so and at that point, most of us in the DevOps space will run a final analysis in terms of, sort of our decision-making tools to ultimately go ahead and make sure that before this is handed over to, the SRE group, or the group that's maintaining the application once it's deployed, that they get that final sign-off that says, hey, we didn't see anything that looked odd. It's now in your hands. And so again, I think at each step along the way here, as you can see, and the theme here, guys, is, I think you're picking up on it, is we're really sort of slowly exposing more and more traffic to this new release, and at each step along the way, analyzing and assessing the risk, and then deciding to move forward. And then there's the percentage rollouts, and I've got you see the screen capture. I've got a pipeline that we'll walk through today that sort of shows you how that works. But here, we're going to slowly shape traffic to increase the pressure on the new release, right? So here, I'm going to go ahead and deploy the new release. I'm going to go ahead and actually split off 30% of the traffic, run a validation, right, after an hour, 2 hours, whatever I choose, right? Wherever I can get a statistically relevant sample size, right? Then I'm going to go ahead and split 50% of the traffic, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to run another analysis to decide if I move forward. And then there's my 100%. And then I decide, do I roll forward or I roll back, right? Or at any point along the way, if I see that 30%, sort of in something's going wrong there, I need to be able to reshape the traffic to point at the old release while I figure out what's going on. So again, in a really controlled way, we want to have cross-team coordination across DevOps, product owners, and SREs. to make sure that the percentages are agreed to. We want to have something that's automated, that's doing the analysis. I want to make data-based decisions here. I don't want to, sort of do a back of the napkin or this looks good, type of scenario. And I always need to have that traffic shaping available to me. Again, I think that's fairly rudimentary and sort of understood amongst this crowd, but I think, it's important to note that we need to be able to go ahead and actually instrument that traffic shaping. And that's our primary way of sort of rolling back per se, right? If I get to that 30% landmark and during my traffic validation, I start to see something that looks ominous, I want to be able to flip the switch and move back to the old. I don't want to proceed to the next. And again, this is that idea of sort of, again, slowly rolling, making sure that I'm sort of at each step of the way analyzing what exactly it is that's happening with the deployment, and in consumable bites. And again, controlling my risk in real time. So let's talk about some considerations when executing progressive delivery. And I think, guys, this is another slide that you all know, anyone that's seen any of my events knows that I like to use, because I feel like it just really sort of hammers home, where the problem points are, right? So of course, we have that automation problem, right? And anytime we're doing progressive delivery or any type of quote unquote safe rollout, we need to have an orchestration tool that's up to task, right? I need to be able to design these pipelines, and I need to be able to automate this as much as possible. If you're working in an environment where you have 15, 20, 30 different applications, internal and external, that you're responsible for, you cannot achieve this in any sort of manual type of scenario. It just won't work. It'll be very, very difficult. You need to be able to automate these processes, and then ultimately just have a human be inserted in terms of where those critical decisions are made. But you also have to be able to generate the data to make those decisions, and that's something that we're going to talk about here as we move forward in the presentation. But I think, and then, so automation is one piece. We have to have an automation tool that's up to the task. Then we have our command and control problem. And again, you guys know I love talking about this, but I think it's so important to understand, because just because we're doing progressive delivery and we're managing our risk from a exposing our customers to badness perspective, it doesn't mean we can ignore all the other bits of risk that we inherit just in doing a CD process, right? So we have to make sure that while we're pulling this off, that we're continuing to sort of manage all the other risks that surround this deployment. So, I want to make sure that, again, the diagnostics and verification steps. So at each point along the way, how is the application performing? Is there any anomalous behavior from a log or metric perspective that I need to be aware of, and as part of making that decision to move forward? But before we roll this out to anybody, I need to still make sure that my policy checks are done, and my security checks are done. I don't want to release something even to 10% of my customer base if there's a security vulnerability or a security hole there. I want to make sure that, from a policy perspective, that it meets policy. If I have a policy around exposed ports, in public-facing load balancers, those types of scenarios. Again, progressive deployment will help manage risk in terms of exposing customer badness. We still need to make sure that our policy, security, and vulnerability risks are also mitigated from that perspective. And that's all part of this scenario. And again, we can't forget about those things. And that's why I wanted to, as I was putting this presentation together, I wanted to sort of circle back to this and make sure that we understood that this is not a replacement for some of the other risk mitigation that we're responsible for as DevOps professionals. And again, that balancing act, right? So when we think about, sort of command and control and how we manage these pillars, the velocity piece here, I think, progressive delivery is an enabler to velocity, which is a good thing. We want to be able to do that because, again, we are wanting to manage that one element of risk, which is how does this thing going to perform? If I manage all the other bits of risk and I don't do progressive delivery and there's a problem, now I've exposed 100% of my customers for some period of time, which those of you that have been doing this for a while know businesses don't react well to that. They don't want that. And so again, it's going to enable you to manage that velocity and ultimately make sure that you're continuing to deliver at velocity. As far as risk goes, again, I think all the other bits of risk are still there. What you're managing here through progressive delivery is, or progressive rollouts, is that idea that I want to, again, very slowly introduce, or relatively slowly introduce my user base to this new application and see how it performs, and make sure that I'm controlling the blast radius should something bad happen. And then obviously with quality, left of deploy, you've got a QA team that's doing some things. You've got some unit tests that have been run against the code, but now you also want to make sure you're doing that anomaly detection. So at each stage along the way, you're doing that quality check. Is this thing holding up? Is there something here that I need to be worried about? Am I seeing error messages that weren't exposed in any other stage now that users are putting or applying pressure to the application? So again, I think again, these slides are redundant, and for that I apologize, but I feel like these are still important things that we need to be considering as we go through progressive delivery. And again, that automation, the ability to go ahead and actually deliver at velocity, and manage that security and risk compliance, and ultimately meet the quality requirements as you're doing this. And so we're gonna walk through, sort of how we go about doing this, and sort of what are the pillars, and how OpsMx can help you do this. Because I feel like, guys, the bottom line here is, at least it's been in my experience, that if you have the right set of tooling, the underlying orchestration and automation tooling, and then the risk assessment and management tooling, then that velocity will just flourish, right? You'll be able to deliver with confidence at velocity, and you'll be able to implement these progressive delivery strategies in such a way that makes it easy, because you don't have to worry about the other bits that are surrounding it. You can focus on, what is the customer experience looking like, and are there any anomalies now that this is getting some real customer pressure or real user pressure that I need to be aware of, because all the other bits have been dealt with for you. And I think that's the key. My presentations wouldn't be complete without sort of describing to you sort of what OpsMx can do. And then we're going to move on to sort of a demo of some of these pipelines, so you get to see some real world scenarios in terms of progressive delivery. But I think that when we come to sort of what is the solution that OpsMx can provide, and my hope is that, one, that you've learned something from this, or got sort of a perspective around progressive delivery, but also you get a chance to maybe think about taking a look at sort of how we might be able to help you get there. And I think our stack is sort of that way, right? Is really what we're after. Is, obviously the automation and orchestration parts of this, right now, whether it be Spinnaker, Jenkins, Argo, we can certainly help you, depending on, regardless of which one of these things that you're using, in terms of orchestration and how you're automating those things, right? And that's sort of key, because you can't do progressive delivery without automation. It just won't work. You have to have some level of automation there to make that work. And then obviously, that other piece of this that we were talking about earlier, in terms of automating decisions, being able to make data-driven decisions. How are you doing that, right? You don't want to stop and crawl through logs and wait, and especially when there's a canary out there, right? You want to be able to generate this data quickly. You want to be able to make spot decisions based on data that you're actually seeing, and the things you're seeing happening in that deployment. And that's really where OpsMx can come into play. And we're going to talk a little bit about how Autopilot helps you sort of make those assessments, in real time, as you're going through and have to make a decision on, what do I do with this thing, right? On the surface, it looked okay, but how do I know that everything is as we're expecting? And how do I know when I flip the switch on this, 20 minutes later, I'm not going to have a problem, or a day later, I'm not going to have a problem? What rocks am I turning over? And that's really where Autopilot is going to be in a position to help. So let's go ahead and actually do a walkthrough of some pipelines. Let me show you what I've got going on here, just so I think, because I think you'll find it interesting. Let me go ahead and refresh this to make sure I'm still logged in. Perfect. So the first one I have here that I think again is really interesting is sort of that rolling thunder type of deployment, right? And sort of how we're doing that rolling thunder deployment with Spinnaker and that automation associated with Spinnaker. And so obviously, one of the things that we're doing here is we're doing our initial deployment, right? So we're deploying, in this case, just a manifest that's being stored in Git, right? So I'm going to go out and grab that manifest. It's an artifact that's been brought into the pipeline. And then the first thing I'm going to do, in this case here, I'm using a Kubernetes ingress controller, an Nginx ingress controller, to ultimately go ahead and start the process of waiting my traffic. So I'm going to start to split my traffic here. So as I do the deployment, assuming that that is successful, it will deploy this new version of my application. And then it will go ahead and actually start the process of shaping that traffic. It's going to go ahead and through this ingress controller, give that traffic 30% of the weight, right? And so again, very, very straightforward. Now, here's the first tricky part, right? Now I've steered this in 30% of my traffic in that direction, and the world didn't come to an end, so I'm in good shape. The next part of this, though, is that traffic validation. So what am I going to do here, right? So because in the parlance of Spinnaker, I'm just looking at an accept or reject, right? But we all know that I don't want to leave this at a surface level. Am I hearing anything? Has there been any tickets open? Are there any complaints? What's the status, of some of the monitoring tools? Here, this is really where we want to inject the autopilot continuous verification piece. This is where I'm going to start to get an assessment of what's happening. I've steered 30% of the traffic, and then I've gone ahead and triggered this autopilot assessment. Now, autopilot through its continuous verification piece can link up to the log and metric sources. So if you're using Datadog or Prometheus, or sort of App Dynamics or Splunk or any of those tools to sort of aggregate data associated with a given release, this is really here in that first gate. I want to go ahead and right here, I want to go ahead and trigger this. And I want to be able to see what's going on. Now, what I'm hoping to see here is a score of 100. That means I didn't see anything anomalous. Now, in this case here, I didn't. I saw some things that were very, very concerning, right? And so at this point, I have a choice. I can ultimately go back in and stop this and let it continue to run and observe it again in 30 minutes, or I can reshape my traffic ultimately to push back that 30% of the traffic to the previous release, right? And again, I can do all that through my automation, through my pipeline. But here, the first thing I want to do is sort of see what that score is. That's what I'm going to react to. That's the reaction I'm going to make here. And ultimately, I could simply go in here and have it fail this, right? And then ultimately, if that validate traffic, let's say that score was below a certain threshold, then I would go and simply start rolling back my green deployment. I'd roll that back, and then that would split my traffic back to my original deployment. So this here is that data-driven piece. This is how you're going to make that decision. You can automate it because we're producing that score. And then ultimately you can sort of do that rollback or sort of scale down of the green so that your old release sort of takes back over. While you're doing that, you can then come in here and ultimately understand where the problems were. Here, we're looking at log-based information. And then we're also looking at sort of metric-based information as well. When I look at sort of, hey, this is the baseline for the application. This is what we saw during that 30-minute window that we reshape that traffic. Boy, there's something going on here that we weren't expecting, right? And so again, I think that if we were to go through this and look, this is where we can, now we've only exposed 30% of our traffic. So I don't know if this manifested itself in a negative customer experience. Our SREs and our APM tools should be able to tell us. But the bottom line here is there's enough data here for me to make the decision that this probably shouldn't move forward. However, if the score was 100 and we were able to move it forward, then I would go and then do my next traffic split, right? And here, I'm going to go ahead and actually use the Nginx ingress controller to then steer 50% of the traffic and then run a validate. And then I'm going to go ahead and actually split 100% of the traffic. And as you can see here, guys, I've automated this process, right? I've automated this process. I've injected gates that ultimately can be managed here through the OpsMx layer, where I can certainly see the verification steps here and whether they've passed or failed. And if they've failed, again, I can choose to stop at this point. Oops, wrong one. I can stop at this point and say, I exposed this to 30% of the traffic and it didn't hold up. Let's bail out of this, right? And let's go ahead and roll back to the roll back the green deployment. So again, guys, in this particular sort of rolling thunder example, you can see where you have to have those gates, you have to have data that's going to allow you to make that decision. And then you have to have automation that's going to sort of orchestrate this whole thing to allow it to happen. Now, the other piece of this that's interesting here is, sort of around that Canary deployment. And, if you're doing sort of more of a Canary deployment here, you're going to, you may already have your baseline deployed. So if I'm going to do my Canary deployment through, say, a set of scripts in QA, maybe I want to deploy the baseline build and then I want to deploy the Canary. But in a lot of cases, you're just going to go ahead and deploy the Canary. And then ultimately, once that Canary deployment's done, and as you can see here, we've gone ahead and done that Canary deployment, the build and then the deploy. Then I want to go ahead and ultimately, in this case here, I'm doing a test load, right? Now, instead of shaping actual live traffic, which I could do very easily, again, just using the ingress controller. But in this case here, I've decided to do a Canary in the context of testing. I could run my test load, and then I can ultimately do that autopilot trigger, which would then ultimately get me this set of results here. So if I don't want to, and that's something that I failed to mention, during my the first part of my talk, which was really around, sort of Canary deployments. A lot of people will do this purely in a sort of sterile environment. They'll deploy the baseline build, they'll deploy the new build, and they'll run the same set of test scripts against both. Again, here you're going to be able to get that information that's required if you're looking at sort of running and making a data-driven decision, and as well as sort of automating the fact of gating that release if for some reason that produces some sort of anomalous behavior. So there's another element to that Canary strategy that I failed to mention, right, in terms of doing this in a more controlled environment. But again, I think, we see a lot of customers that will deploy those things to, sort of production traffic, only because that's what their idea of baseline is, right? Is I want that production traffic. And so that's the piece of this that, again, I think we're showing you sort of that automation piece. And again, if I were to look at, sort of some of the gates that the OpsMx, sort of command and control layer allow me to put in here, I can do the verification test. I can run the approval gate. And again, here I can go ahead and ultimately make a decision here on whether or not I want to approve this particular pipeline. And again, I get to see the autopilot verification results. If I want to look at, sort of the Git commits that were associated with this, I can certainly come here and do that. But again, I'm making data-driven decisions here, right? And so whether they be human-assisted gates or automated gates, I'm making data-driven decisions that will help enable my progressive delivery. Again, very, very straightforward to understand from a pipeline perspective. But, obviously, again, when it comes to how do I wrangle this data, how do I make sure that, I'm making the right decision in terms of roll forward or roll back, or, in the case of, say, a QA Canary, to allow this thing to move on from, as an example, sort of the QA pipeline to the production pipeline, right? So, if I'm doing it here, I need data to help me decide whether or not I want to take it from this particular pipeline and pass that deployment off to that production piece. And so again, very, very straightforward, really about sort of data-driven decisions and automation for controlling all of these things. And then the other thing that I wanted to bring you through, guys, because I know it's something that you're asking yourself is, hey, what about traffic shaping? That's one of those things when we talk to more and more customers about, they want to implement these strategies, and they think, sort of what technologies are available to me for being able to do that. And obviously, when we think about Istio, we think about some of the Nginx ingress controller. We had someone that was actually is using AppMesh. And so AWS AppMesh. And so, ultimately we were able to build pipelines out that will allow you to go ahead and actually deploy to an EKS cluster and use AppMesh to do that sort of traffic shaping and that traffic controlling. In this case here, it's in the context of a blue-green. But again, the principles are the same. In a blue-green, I'm just going to go ahead and flip it from 0 to 100 or from 100 to 0, because I just want to make sure that the initial deployment is out there before I tear down the old. And so, but it doesn't really matter in this case, because obviously one of the things I can do is the same type of sort of traffic shaping and weighting that I can go ahead and get here. So here's 90-10, right? Again, very, very straightforward, very, very basic, to be able to go ahead and do that as part of my pipelines, and then come back to that analysis step as I look, each stage along the way. I want to go ahead and, instead of a manual judgment step here, maybe I want to add a data-driven judgment step. And that data-driven judgment step in our case could be autopilot. If you're just a purist and just using Spinnaker, it could be the Kayenta Canary reports. And so, we look here, and again, we can get some of this data out of Spinnaker as well, if you deploy Kayenta along with your Spinnaker. So again, lots of different ways, guys, to do this. And the last part that I want to cover, guys, and I think you hear the words or the terms observability used a lot in sort of that scenario of progressive deployments. My thinking around observability here is this data, the observability around sort of how is the deployment behaving. Are there things that I need to be concerned with? Are there reasons for me to stop or roll this deployment back, right? So that level of observability. But I think there's also, this scenario where I also want to understand, as I'm doing this, what's deployed where, right? I want to look at my pipeline at a higher level, so holistically, and sort of as things are marching through there. And I think that as you're doing sort of that progressive deployment, you want to be able to see in some cases in prod that I've got 2 versions of the same application deployed right now, because I'm doing a canary, or there's 2 versions here because I'm doing a rolling upgrade, right? So I want to be able to understand. This is also, as DevOps guys, this is how we can satisfy the business side and our product owners, and the folks that are SREs that sort of want a snapshot or a high level of what's going on right now, right? I can do that. I can show them this, and ultimately they can get a real sort of bird's eye view. And then if they want to, it's not that hard for them to be able to drill into, sort of how something got there, right? So if I want to look at, one of these things and I want to see sort of how it got there, I can ultimately do that as I look at some of these deployments and sort of see the decision gates that these things went through. Again, I can see that. I can see the data that the DevOps folks and the SREs use to make that decision in terms of moving it forward. So again, guys, I know there's a lot to digest here. I think, to wrap up on my side, on the progressive delivery front, I think, we're really talking about, again, those strategies around being able to really sort of slowly expose your customers to, or your users to, a new deployment, while along the way using tools like Autopilot or Kayenta to gain insight into and allow you to make data-driven decisions as you push it forward, regardless of the style of progressive delivery that you choose. So with that said, I'm going to stop, because I know we've taken up a lot of time with the sort of meat of this, and stop and see if there are any questions. And Mark, I don't know if there are any questions in the chat that you'd want me to address.
Yeah, great. Hey, thanks, Bob. Really, yeah, if you have questions, just put them in the chat, and we'll be more than happy to answer them. Really interesting presentation and demo, of course. I was thinking progressive delivery, really, it's the main thing is about mitigating risk, right? And
it is
it really is, and which is great. But the thing is, if you have, you still need to go fast. And if you have manual intervention, or if you're not making data-driven decisions, or you have to have, people doing verifies, that progressive delivery can bog down big time.
Oh, it does, and Mark, I think the funny part about it is that, progressive delivery without the analysis and the automation of that analysis can almost backfire on you, right?
Yeah.
If you don't do that analysis correctly and make the right decision, you can almost end up exposing yourself to more risk than you intended to. So it's just really important to make sure that you have that analysis, and to maintain that velocity, you've automated that analysis around the health of that deployment. So yeah,
Yeah,
I agree.
I think like you had a use case there, and while we're talking, we'll launch we have one more poll. Like let's say, if you're doing a percentage rollout, each time, you need to have, each time you deploy, it's easy to deploy the bits, but you have to get the data in front of somebody, or in front of software itself, to make that decision to move forward. And if any type of long lead time, in order to make that decision, is exponentially multiplied, right?
Oh yeah, and and here's the thing too, is that by using something that generates, say, a confidence score, right? We all realize the fact that most of these deployments will go fine, right? But it's the small percentage that don't. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do here, Mark, you and I have talked about this before, is sort of take the current paradigm is, let's stop the pipeline and look for a problem. I think the paradigm we're looking to instill is, let's only stop the pipeline if we see a problem, right? And that level of automation and analysis helps you get there, and ultimately mitigate risk by stopping if you see a problem. But why should I stop 100% of the time when I'm only going to find a problem 5% of the time, right?
Yeah, super. Well, look, Bob and everybody, thank you so much for your time. Really interesting area. We'll see how it progresses. While it's got a new name, and it still seems like some of these practices have been probably gone off, been being used by high performance organizations already. But let's see how it unfolds, Bob. And really, everybody, please, thank you so much for joining us today. And please have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks, all. Thank you.